Hi everyone, so today we're going to be looking at the psychodynamic approach, and this is one of two approaches that you learn at A-level, not including the AS approaches, so that's like the biological approach, the cognitive approach, the behavioural approach, etc. So we're going to look first at psychodynamic approach. So the aim here will be able to describe the approach and how it links to Freud, and then apply this understanding of the psychodynamic approach to behaviours. And then finally, evaluating the psychodynamic approach in relation to other approaches. So, using your knowledge of Freud, what are the key assumptions of the psychodynamic approach? Well, there are three here. There is the unconscious mind, instinctive drives, and early childhood experiences. The first is that the unconscious mind is the key to sorting out any problems that we might have with our behaviour. So it's the idea that our things that we've repressed or held back, that we don't want to think about on a daily basis, are having an impact on how we behave. So if someone's repressed something, it might let out in other ways, like through anger or mental health issues or feelings of sadness. The second is instincts and drives, and instincts and drives are related to motivation again, so they motivate how we behave. And it suggests that we go through a series of stages in our childhood development which affect our behaviour and in turn develop our personality. And these are all affected by our early childhood experiences. So what we experience as a child is going to affect our behaviour as an adult. Some of those early childhood experiences might be repressed in our unconscious mind, and therefore we're holding back something. So these early childhood experiences are really important, especially as most of our psychological development, according to Freud, is developed by the age of 6. So first things first is that he believed that there was a structure of our personality. So there were 3 parts to our personality, and these developed at different stages. So if I just move these around for you, you'll see that there are 3, the id, ego and superego, and they develop in that order. So the id is the very first thing to develop, and it's the primitive part of our personality. So it's almost there from birth in a way, but it develops throughout the first 18 months of our lives. And this operates on the pleasure principle, and that's the idea that we get what we want. So at first, our personality is just about us screaming and crying and getting attention in some way so that we get what we want. I imagine this bit as like the little devil on your shoulder, just like constantly like, do this, it would be a really good fun idea, I'd really enjoy that. The second part is the ego, and this is the reality principle, and this develops around the age of 2 when we realise that we can't get everything we want. And it mediates the id and the superego, so it has to decide which one it's going to listen to. The last one is the superego, and that develops around the age of 5 years old. And this is when we start to realise that there are morally right and wrong things to do, regardless of the law. So we understand what is morally right and wrong. And I imagine that's kind of the little angel on your shoulder telling you to do the right thing. So you've got a little devil on your shoulder, a little angel on your shoulder, and then your ego is your head having to decide what to do, whether it listens to the id or listens to the superego. And that will happen on like a daily, minute by minute, hour by hour time period. So this is happening all the time, and sometimes your id will win out and sometimes your superego will win out. So you've got either of those like winning each time you come across a new situation. So on the side there it says a child doesn't get the ice cream they want, how would they react at different ages? So hopefully you should say that as a baby, they'll just cry or get really angry and they won't understand, they just want the ice cream. At age 2, we might realise that it's just not possible to get the ice cream because there isn't any ice cream nearby. And by 3, we understand that maybe it's, by age 5, we understand the morals of it. So it might not be acceptable to eat ice cream when we're freezing cold outside in -3 degrees. So you have a better understanding of whether it's okay to ask for it or not. Another example of this is not asking because you know that your mum doesn't have any money at the moment, so it wouldn't be the right thing to do. The problem with studying this is that these things don't actually exist in terms of not physically. There isn't a part of your brain that is the id or the ego or the superego, and that makes it difficult to study this behaviour because it's not tangible, okay? And therefore it's not falsifiable, which is a really key point of this whole approach, is that we can't prove that the id exists and we can't prove that it doesn't exist, which makes it very difficult to study, and therefore reducing the validity of the approach. The second part is the role of the unconscious. So all 3 of these, id, ego and superego, are part of our unconscious, but we also have an iceberg structure of unconsciousness, as Freud describes it. And that's the idea that as an iceberg, most of the ice you can't see, it's underwater, but there's a tiny bit on the top. So we have 3 parts to our unconscious, and the bit that's on the surface that we can see is our conscious mind. This is the part that we're aware of. So our everyday thoughts about different things that are going on in our life, like what we fancy for dinner, etc., is all in our conscious mind. And then just underneath the water, there's this tiny bit of pre-conscious that we're aware of what's going on, of some thoughts in our head. So we might be aware that we're stressed, for example, but these are thoughts that are kind of just out of reach almost, like they're just there, you can feel it, but you can't explain what they are. And then finally we have our unconscious, and these are the thoughts that occur without any conscious awareness, so we have no idea that they're going on in our head, and they take up a significant amount of our iceberg. So there's an example here on the right where you can see how it's all fits together. So you can see that at the top we've got our conscious, then we've got a tiny bit of pre-conscious here, and then we've got the unconscious. And these relate to, as I said, the 3 parts of our personality. And you can see that the id is entirely unconscious because we repress that. We know as adults what we want in our life, but we know that we can't always get that. So that bit of our brain just isn't, or our unconscious isn't prominent in our everyday life. The superego is our morals, and part of our morals are in our conscious because we have to sometimes be consciously aware of what morality, where we sit morally at times when people question your morality. But also we have our unconscious morals that are have been there from our childhood and our childhood experiences, that we can't always tangibly tell you what our morals are if you had to list them, but they play a part in how you behave. And then our ego is the bit that has to decide whether we listen to our superego or our id, and therefore that does have a bit of conscious awareness as well. So if we have an imbalance in our personality, Freud said that this causes us stress, and generally that might lead to mental health issues. And what it means is if the id, ego and superego are unbalanced, for example, where we often listen to our id or we often listen to our superego, this causes us stress. So if someone's superego is too strong, they're more likely to have characteristics that are self-righteous or pompous. Whereas if our id is too strong, then you're more likely to show antisocial behaviour or more likely to be self-centred. So it's a real balance between all of these personalities, and if we don't get it right, then we're likely to feel this stress and anxiety that will come out in different ways. And in order to cope with all of this, we employ defence mechanisms. So my example here, and these defence mechanisms are used to reduce your anxiety. And my example here is that you want a chocolate bar, but you know you're meant to be on a diet and you feel guilty if you have it, but unsatisfied if you don't. So you're feeling anxious either way. And so your mind develops various methods to cope or protect itself or defend itself. For example, you might justify that it's okay to eat the chocolate because it's good for you. So justifying your behaviour, that's rationalisation. For the exam, you only really need to know about 3 defence mechanisms. There are loads of them that Freud talked about, so don't worry if you see lots of other ones that you're unsure of. You only need to know the next 3 for the exam. But these are all unconscious and we're not aware that we're using these often. But it can lead to mental abnormalities or psychosis, for example, if you rely on these too much. So the first one is denial, and this is refusing to acknowledge an aspect of reality. Okay, for example, the first example down there is a smoker refusing to admit that smoking is bad for their health, even though they really know that it is. The second is repression, and this is about forcing bad memories out of your mind because you don't want to deal with them. So, for example, refusing to admit you hate your mum because she is with your dad and you want to be with your mum. We're going to go over that more in a second, but that's the idea of the Oedipus complex, where girls fancy their dads and boys fancy their mums. The final one is displacement, and this is about putting a feeling onto someone or something else. So this is, for example, slamming the door after a row with your girlfriend, taking it out on the door rather than on your girlfriend because you can't take it out on your girlfriend, or shouting at your sister because your teacher told you off today and you're in a bad mood. So it's moving it onto someone else or something else. So those are the answers to those. So this links to the psychosexual stages because Freud suggested that if we are in one of these, we're stuck in one of these psychosexual stages, then we're likely to experience problems or mental health issues potentially because of this. And Freud believed that we went through a series of stages as a child which have different thoughts and different urges. And these are usually all to do with gaining sexual pleasure, because Freud believed that children are born with a libido or with a sex drive. So in order to be psychologically healthy and fulfilled in life, we must complete all of these stages so that we can move into adulthood. But mental abnormalities or problems with mental health issues might happen if we're fixed at one stage and we can't move on. And all these urges are unconscious desires, so we're not necessarily aware of it and we can't do much about it. So at the oral stage, children are focused on in life breastfeeding, because at that stage you're being breastfed or potentially bottle fed. But anyway, so there is a enjoyment that you get from the mouth. So they said at this stage, your fixation is on your mouth. At the anal stage, we start to learn to be potty trained, and therefore we're more aware of what is coming out of our bodies because we are being trained to be aware of what is coming out of our bodies. And we can move on from this stage once we've effectively are able to be potty trained and go to the loo by ourselves. At the phallic stage, children are more aware of their genitalia, and this is because children start to realise the difference between boys and girls, and physically between boys and girls. And this leads to the Oedipus and Electra complex. So this is the desire for the opposite sex parent. So if you're a girl, you fancy your mum and your dad, and if you're a boy, you fancy your mum, and you're jealous that your other parent gets to be with them and you don't. Okay, and that's why you tend to have daddy's girls or mummy's boys. Again, this isn't accounting for, because Freud's theory was developed a long time ago, having same-sex parents, for example, or for just being homosexual. The latent phase is when you start to be more aware of your sex and your sexual urges, so therefore you try and hide these in other things. So you don't tend to show any real behaviours here other than doing lots of activities and being involved in lots of things so that you're distracted from your unconscious desires. And then as you develop into puberty, a focus again becomes on genitalia, and therefore you want to experience a healthy adult relationship, so you don't focus so much on your parents anymore, but you look to other people that you might be able to be with. So if we get stuck at one of these stages, then we show certain behaviours. So at the oral stage, we're more obsessed, as adults, we might show these behaviours. So because the oral stage is associated with your mouth, you're more likely to take up smoking or bite your nails or be sarcastic, so using your mouth to be sarcastic, or critical. So those kind of behaviours might mean that you're stuck at the oral stage. If you're stuck at the anal stage, you can show two different types of behaviour. So a kind of perfectionist or obsessive kind of, he's alluding to that OCD which hadn't been recognised at that stage, but that kind of perfectionist personality, i.e. you don't want anything coming out of you because it's dirty and not clean. Or expulsive, like really interested in what's coming out of you. The kids at this age might like touch what's coming, like their excretion that comes out of them because it's interesting, but as adults it might just come out as being a messy person who can't be organised and very thoughtless. At the phallic stage, you're more likely to be narcissistic and potentially homosexual. Now remember, this is from an age in which homosexuality was illegal and very unusual to be. It would seem very unusual because people wouldn't say anything about it. So you've got to keep that in mind. If you're stuck at the latent stage, then your libido is dormant, so just not showing any interest in sex, which can be a concern. And finally, at the genitalia stage, you have difficulty forming heterosexual relationships because you don't know how to behave with other people. So hopefully that's helped you. You now need to think about what therefore are the key assumptions. So go back again to what we talked about the unconscious mind, about the different stages of behaviour, etc. Having a think about the evaluation, I've got 4 main points here. The main positive of this approach is that it was a very early approach for psychology, and it had a massive impact on recognising psychology and psychological treatments as a positive, as a benefit, as something that we should be interested in studying. So although Freud seems very odd now, it was people genuinely believed in what he was saying and came to him for advice and help and support with their children or themselves, and he had a massive impact on people being treated and people being listened to and their childhood experiences being recognised as potentially problematic, and therefore you should look after the child. This is really important because he was the one who basically created a talking therapy. So any therapies that have created now are based on Freud's ideas, even very loosely. Just the idea that we should talk about our feelings is something that Freud was suggesting. He only really used case studies, and a really interesting one to look up would be about little Hans, who's a little boy that Freud looked after. Not to be confused with Little Albert. You can read up about his study, and there's lots of evidence to support his theory from the study of little Hans. However, lots of the studies that he undertook were all case studies, so there are problems here because case studies are limited in application. You can't generalise it to other people. Freud also created a way of assessing the unconscious by discussing dreams. So you can look up dream analysis, which he also created by analysing the unconscious thoughts through people describing their dreams, because he felt that the only way to access the unconscious was through dreams, because when we're dreaming, we're in a state of unconsciousness. So if we analyse those dreams, we might be able to work out people's problems. But this isn't falsifiable, because we can never prove that that dream is what their unconscious is saying, and whether what we've interpreted the dream as is correct, because you can interpret a dream in one way and I can interpret it in another way, and therefore it can get confused and may not be reliable. And finally, other psychologists and philosophers have argued, therefore, that his method lacks scientific rigour. We can't repeat the study, we can't prove either way whether the studies or the theory is correct, and therefore that reduces the validity of the approach. I hope you enjoyed listening to that. There are lots of details for this approach, so just make sure that you're comfortable with all of them, but also you can see how they link to one another. So how does the unconscious fit with the personality and the psychosexual stages? Like, make sure when you explain it that they all link together. Thank you very much.